So a few housekeeping notes. The first is we are recording this session, and if anyone doesn't want to appear on the recording, please just keep your camera off. We have closed caption enabled for the session, so please just enable that on your own screen if that would be helpful to you. The chat is open. You are free to use the chat to say hello and to introduce yourselves and to tell us about yourselves. But also if you have questions during the presentations, you need clarification, please put them in the chat. But we will also have an opportunity at the end of the session for some discussion. You have a reactions button on your screen somewhere. You can raise your hand. You can give us a smiley face if you want to. So let us know if you have any trouble using any of that. So I don't want to take up any more time. I'm going to hand over to Elisa, who will be moderating this panel. Over to you, Elisa.
Thank you so much, Dina, and it's indeed an exciting topic for today, exploration. So good morning, afternoon, and evening to all those who are joining us. I think the ocean climate nexus is becoming clearer and clearer and is moving ahead politically, but we actually know quite a lot about the connections and the role of the ocean in the global climate cycle already from a science perspective. And while in the climate regime, we speak quite a lot about human rights, even if we have still various challenges to be overcome. I think the ocean, the questions related to human rights in the ocean context remain a bit less explored. And so bringing together and opportunities for learning about climate justice and the discussion of human rights in the international climate change regime, and reflecting on that, what that means for the ocean regimes and the interactions between the two is really important and timely. And in fact, maybe we even have to catch up with time in some ways. So we're very fortunate to have today, I think, 4 panelists who will speak for 15 minutes each and help us shed a light on a few areas of the climate-ocean nexus. There are actually many more facets that we can possibly cover today, but hopefully that's a helpful start of the conversation. And if people in the audience, of course, have their own knowledge and experiences on these topics, they're very welcome to share them with us, particularly after the series of presentations where we can have an open discussion. Our first presenter is Mitchell Lennon, who is part of the One Ocean Hub, is a PhD researcher at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, UK, and will be introducing the topic of today's discussion. Mitchell, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Elisa, for that. I'm just going to share my screen just now, 2 seconds. And then I go presenter view. If you can just holler if that's clear to everybody, 2 seconds. Is that fine? Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Thumbs up. Awesome. Thank you very much. Yeah, so thanks so much for that introduction, Elisa. Hugely appreciated. I've got the privilege of kind of opening this panel and the slightly more easy job, I guess, introducing the ocean climate nexus from both a scientific perspective and also a legal one, and how that nexus interacts with human rights. So I've kept it relatively short and sweet just to give other panelists time to kind of go into different things in more detail, but I'll try and cover this as sort of comprehensively as I can. Okay, so kind of scientific evidence has been mounting on how the health of the ocean is significantly impacted by climate change. I think the most kind of seminal and comprehensive report on that is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's special report on the ocean and cryosphere and the changing climate that came out in 2019. And this has kind of illustrated how the health of the ocean has been impacted by climate change, and the impact on ocean health obviously multiplies impacts from other threats, for example, overexploitation or pollution in the marine environment. And then on the other hand, the ocean is incredibly important in climate regulation. Okay, so the ocean absorbs over 1/4 of global carbon dioxide. And then this is kind of what we mean by the ocean climate nexus. Okay, this sort of refers to both the negative impacts of climate change on the ocean's health, and then as well as the ocean's role in global climate regulation. Okay, now one of the issues I think we're finding as both legal and scientific researchers is this sort of lack of integrated approaches to the nexus. This sort of impedes effective protection of the marine environment. It leaves out a crucial area of international cooperation and national action for climate mitigation. adaptation. Now at COP26, I mean, one of the kind of a very used motto, I think, during the negotiations was sort of ocean action is climate action. That's kind of trying to illustrate how important the ocean is in the global climate system. Now on to kind of human rights. The Ocean Climate Nexus is essential also from a human rights perspective. Everybody's human rights to food, to life, to health, water, culture, and of course a right to a healthy environment depends on a healthy ocean. The ocean provides us with nutritious foods. It contributes to the renewal of fresh water. It produces half of the oxygen we breathe. And then, since climate impacts on marine ecosystems and their benefit to humanity, climate is kind of impacted through then warming, acidification, deoxygenation, and these threats then are indeed human rights issues. Considering that sort of human rights and biodiversity are interdependent, and this has been kind of confirmed by the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. And of course, the interdependency of human rights and climate change as well. And these are kind of relevant insofar as the protection and multiple uses of the ocean kind of contribute to climate change or contribute to climate change mitigation or adaptation. So then kind of moving on to the more kind of legal side of things. If we look at if we understand the kind of ocean climate nexus through the kind of United Nations sort of treaty system, under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, states have a sort of general obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment and to prevent pollution. The definition of pollution in the convention is sort of broad enough to certainly include impacts from CO2 and also kind of warming and acidification. And now I've said this obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment is a general one. And as a framework convention, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is informed by what we call kind of generally agreed international rules and standards. So that will come from other more specialized treaties or other legal instruments. So, for example, with relation to protection and preservation of the marine environment and climate change, you would look at, say, the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC, and also countries' nationally determined contributions as that standard. And then when we look at climate law, one thing, in fact, I should add, I think with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, in terms of integration of human rights, is rather poor. I think this is a consequence of the time it was drafted in the 1970s. So you tend not to see a great integration of human rights instruments within the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. However, with the climate system, on the other hand, you do see human rights language used. You see that reflected in the UNFCCC and in the Paris Agreement. For example, the kind of principle of intergenerational equity is included in there as well. And then in terms of including the ocean in the climate system, in the UN climate system, you have the ocean included as part of the hydrosphere is the definition of the climate system in the UNFCCC. The ocean is also mentioned in the preamble of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement also mentions adapting to climate change to ensure kind of food systems and food security. So one could argue that sort of implicitly includes fisheries and fishery systems and a healthy marine ecosystem therein. And then moving to kind of more recent developments, last year in November at Glasgow at COP26, we now have the Glasgow Climate Pact, which exclusively explicitly includes the ocean in a kind of series of COP decisions. And they mentioned the term kind of ocean-based action, but that's sort of yet to be fleshed out. They've also mandated an annual dialogue at the subsidiary body of scientific and technological advice at the UNFCCC to work on how to sort of strengthen ocean-based action and to flesh out kind of what different priorities are. So yeah, I guess it's a sort of rough explanation of the kind of legal and the legal kind of human rights and climate nexus. Okay. And then kind of in terms of moving forward in future developments, what we're excited to see is the sort of inclusion of the ocean in the Committee on the Convention of the Rights of the Child and their kind of general comment number 26 on a children's human right to a healthy environment with a focus on climate change. We're really keen to make sure that the ocean is recognised as an important and inclusive part of the climate system. Otherwise, we don't believe that the comment will be as particularly effective. We're hoping for more kind of explicit recognition of a right to a healthy ocean, for example, and UNFCCC policies on ocean-based action. And then also finally kind of utilisation of climate finance for marine climate adaptation and mitigation measures. And I mentioned earlier the phrase ocean action is climate action. What seems to be coming up now is a lot of folk are saying, you know, climate finance is ocean finance as well. So yeah, that was just a short introduction, I guess, because I don't really want to take too much time away from my other panelists who are going to kind of talk about more things, things in more sort of detail. So I'll stop there and then pass on to our next panelist. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Mitchell. And maybe just to share with the colleagues on the call that you were attending virtually the first ocean dialogue at the SABSTA last week. So maybe there may be some insights that we may explore in the chat, in the conversation later. And just to say that, of course, the opportunity of both ocean and climate action, as well as climate finance being used for ocean action, presents both opportunities to promote and protect human rights, as well as risks. And we can draw on the, I think, well-documented negative impacts of earlier climate action on human rights and what has been learned in that context, and really reflect on how that might affect the ocean moving forward. So a really important area for learning across the two regimes. But thank you so much for setting the scene so nicely, and also really looking further afield into the horizon of other relevant processes that are important for the ocean climate nexus. So with that, we'll pass on the floor to Elisha Harold-Collib from the University of Eastern Finland Law School, who will be speaking specifically about one aspect of the ocean climate nexus, which is ocean acidification and the human rights impacts it has. So Elisha, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Alyssa, and thanks, Mitchell, for that really great introduction as well. So I'm going to dive deeper into the issue of ocean acidification specifically, and talk to the issue of how ocean acidification impacts human rights. So before I get started, though, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which I work and live. Whilst I work at the University of Eastern Finland, I'm actually presently in Australia. So I'd like to acknowledge the Bunurong and Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge their continuing connection to their culture and land, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I think that this acknowledgement of Indigenous connection to their lands and cultures and traditions offers a perfect jumping off point to discuss human rights and ocean acidification, because it is this interwoven nature of life and culture that are dependent upon a healthy ocean and the services it provides. And it is exactly these human rights, the access to food, health, water, a stable climate and culture, that are put at risk by ocean acidification. So in this short session, my 15 minutes, there are 3 questions that I want to try and tackle with you. The first is, what is ocean acidification? The second is, what are the impacts of ocean acidification on humans and human rights? And then the third is, what can be done to prevent these impacts? So first, I just want to have a quick look at what is ocean acidification. So ultimately, it's a chemical process. This is the chemical equation of ocean acidification. Don't get freaked out by the chemistry of it. I will walk you all through it right now. So let's break that down. Sorry, I've just skipped a few slides here. So we've got very basic, the ocean. We've got water in the ocean. We've got carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We've also got some other things in the ocean here. We've got calcium carbonate, which are the shells and skeletons of what we call calcifiers. So things like coral reefs, mollusks, that basically use these carbonate ions to build their shells and skeletons. So what happens as there's more and more carbon dioxide building up in the atmosphere? That carbon dioxide is absorbed into the ocean. And so that carbon dioxide doesn't just stay as carbon dioxide in the ocean, but rather it mixes with water and creates an acid, and creates this carbonic acid in the ocean. And so that carbonic acid, though, doesn't remain as a carbonic acid as it's shown here. But one of the things we know about acids and how we measure acids is actually how many hydrogen ions they release. So this carbonic acid releases hydrogen ions and leaving carbonate ions. But hydrogen ions are very reactive, very active. And so what they do is they actually try and find things to bond with. And so they find these carbonate ions and they bond with those carbonate ions, creating bicarbonate. And so ultimately what the process that's happening here is that the carbonate ions, which are the building blocks of the shells and skeletons of these calcifiers, get bound up and are no longer available to the calcifiers. But as ocean acidification continues, not only does it bind up the existing carbonate ions, but as those carbonate ions all get bound up, all get used up, and there's no availability left, those hydrogen ions actually start to dissolve already existing shells and skeletons. And so we see those shells and skeletons starting to dissolve, so coral reefs, mollusks, and those hydrogen ions actually bond with the carbonate ions that they've essentially taken out of those existing structures. And so basically what we're seeing happening throughout the ocean is that it's becoming much more difficult for these calcifiers to continue to build their shells and skeletons. And not only that, but as ocean acidification progresses, we also see shells and skeletons start to dissolve as well. So this is known to be sort of the most significant impact of ocean acidification on marine organisms. But there's lots of other impacts too, to acid-base relationships and things like that, which also creates an imbalance for many species in the oceans and changes the chemical conditions in which they are adapted to. But when we talk about these shells and skeletons, what does this actually mean? And so this is a lab experiment that was done on a pteropod. So pteropods are little swimming sea snails that are found almost everywhere throughout the ocean, but they're really important at the base of the polar and subpolar food webs. Some people refer to them as the potato chips of the sea because everybody eats them. And so in this lab experiment, these pteropod shells were exposed to acidic or ocean acidification conditions expected at the end of this century. And over a period of a few weeks, this pteropod shell, you can see, starting to sort of go brittle and ultimately starting to dissolve until it reached a point after, I think it was about 6 weeks, that it was completely unlivable. And so it's important to remember that this is an uninhabited shell. And so if it had a pteropod inside it, that pteropod would be diverting energy to try and maintain its shell. But ultimately, that diversion of energy takes away from other important processes which it would need in order to survive. And this is not only what we're seeing in the lab now. Over the last 5 years or so, during the winter time, we've actually found pteropods with these kinds of holes, pockmarked shells throughout the Southern Ocean. So we are already seeing these impacts occurring in the natural environment. what sort of time scale are we talking about? So that experiment that I showed you was for conditions expected at the end of this century. But if we look back over more than 20 million years ago, we can see that the pH of the ocean, or the acidity of the ocean, has stayed relatively stable over the last 20 million years. If we look now where we're at, from sort of 1800 to the year 2000, ocean acidification, or the pH of the ocean, basically plummeted instantaneously if we're talking about a geological timescale. So we can see that it's not only the magnitude of change which we're subjecting marine species to, but it's also the speed of the change. So we've got a massive change which species haven't experienced for over 20 million years, and it's happening faster than at any point in recorded history. So what does this mean for the ocean? So that's the second question. What are the actual impacts? So we need to remember also that at any point we're going to have impacts in the natural environment. You're always going to have winners and losers. But when we think about ocean acidification, we do have winners, but they tend to be species that we don't particularly love or rely upon. And so we're changing the oceans we're shifting the oceans in a way that we don't necessarily recognise or particularly enjoy. And so I remember for many years ago, many scientists who started studying ocean acidification started talking about the sort of weedy slime ocean that we're going to see in the future. And so we can have a look at sort of some of the species that are likely to be impacted. So we've spoken about the pteropods already, the base of the subpolar and polar food webs. And then we've got those calcifiers, benthic invertebrates. So we've got the sort of mollusks, oysters, coral reefs. So these are known as really important ecosystem engineers. Mollusks and oysters filter feeders, so they clean the water of pollutants and toxins, but they are shown to be some of the most vulnerable species to ocean acidification. We've also got coral reefs, which have been projected to disappear by the middle of this century, essentially, if ocean acidification and climate change continue at the rate that they are. And coral reefs, as we know, are really important in terms of fisheries. It's thought that up to a quarter of all marine species are provided habitat by coral reefs at some point in their lifetimes. So coral reefs, really important habitat for many species throughout the ocean. But then we can go up to the seaweeds and seagrasses, which are actually some of the groups of species that are thought to actually be winners in a more acidified ocean. And that's because they essentially use carbon dioxide. So that helps them to grow. Interestingly, though, it's been found that by co-locating seaweeds and calcifiers, they can actually help to moderate ocean acidification and help to allow those calcifiers to continue to grow. So seagrasses especially tend to be very degraded throughout the ocean. And so one of the ways we can actually help to combat ocean acidification on a local scale is by actually rebuilding those seagrass beds. Then we've got jellies that are thought to do better in an acidified ocean as well. Unfortunately, jellies are not one of those species we particularly love to eat or love to swim with or love to look at. They tend to be considered more of a pest species, although turtles do like to eat them, so there's a plus side there. But in interestingly also, when scientists first started looking at the sort of biological impacts of ocean acidification, it was sort of assumed that it would be the lower order species that would be impacted. But over the last 10 years, so ocean acidification research is only about 20 years old, so it's still relatively new. But over the last decade, we've started to see a fair amount of research coming out to show that higher order species are also directly impacted by ocean acidification, and not only impacted by the sort of trophic cascade that we thought was going to be the impacts. So we've seen with some species of fish that their brain develops differently in an acidified ocean, which ultimately impacts their sense of smell, sense of hearing, which impacts whether they can tell whether another fish is a prey or predator. Also means that they find it difficult to find their way back to the reef in order to settle when they need to grow up. So these are just some of the impacts across ecosystems. And ultimately, these are all going to scale up and have impacts on humans. And this is some of the sort of newest research around ocean acidification, human health and ocean acidification impacts, things like that, that we're still trying to get a grasp on. But the impacts are likely to be shown in tourism. So mental health, how do humans relate to the oceans? They enjoy swimming, diving, things like that. And we're likely to see impacts to tourism, also going to impact those who are financially dependent upon ecotourism and marine tourism in general. We're likely to see nutritional impacts as well, both in terms of less availability to food, and also there's research showing that there's going to be impacts to the way pollutants now travel up to humans through the food web. Seaweeds and seagrasses, seaweeds in particular, have been shown to have increased levels of iodine in them when they're raised in more acidic conditions. So lots of impacts to the nutritional content of food as well, which will impact those most dependent with fewer options in terms of their food resources. Then we've got, as we said, fisheries impacts. So that's going to have significant impacts to both nutrition, as I just said, but also those who are actually working in fisheries industries. And artisanal and smaller scale fisheries are going to be heavily impacted as well. And then another impact that we're likely to see is coastal protection, both in terms of human safety, but also the long-term impacts of coastal inundation. So as coral reefs begin to degrade and as sea levels rise because of climate change, we're likely to see larger storm surges, worse inundation along those coasts where those coral reefs have been degraded. So they're sort of a collection of the impacts that we're likely to see to humans because of ocean acidification. So I've only got about a minute left, I think. And so one of the things that I quickly wanted to cover was how do we actually respond to ocean acidification? And so we can look at this and we can divide responses into mitigation, adaptation, and redress options. And so when we're thinking about mitigation, at the global level, the only driver of ocean acidification is increased carbon dioxide emissions. So the only way to effectively stop ocean acidification is essentially bringing carbon dioxide emissions down to zero. And so that obviously is going to be part of what's happening within the climate regime. And so that is a really important element to be spoken about there. Unfortunately, ocean acidification does not really factor at all within the climate regime. And that's a whole nother discussion that we could have. Certainly happy to have a conversation about that in question time if people are interested. But ocean acidification, as I said, has not really been brought into decision-making within the climate regime at this stage. Then when we talk about the adaptation responses to ocean acidification, we can pass those out into sort of two categories or two areas for action. We've got strengthening resilience and adaptive capacity. So that's both focusing on resilience of ecosystems themselves, but also of human communities, which is really important, obviously. And then we've got the other area for action, which is reducing local ocean acidification. So there's a whole series of responses that can be enacted here, which actually allow for local actions that can reduce local ocean acidification. And whilst I said carbon dioxide is the only global driver of ocean acidification, by reducing those local factors that exacerbate ocean acidification, we can give ecosystems and human communities a bit more time to sort of allow adaptation to take place while we're getting mitigation in place. And so that's really important. These local reduction activities can really have quite a substantial impact at the local level. And then the last element or the last sort of component is redress. And here we talk about restoring degraded ecosystems and also harm management. So things like compensation, insurance, liability cases. But these are things that have almost been unaddressed at this stage in relation to ocean acidification. And so something that really needs a conversation around it. So if we were talking in the sort of climate rubric, we'd be talking about loss and damage here. And so when we think about loss, we need to factor in ocean acidification here. And then in terms of damage, in terms of restoring degraded ecosystems, the question here is whether these ecosystems can even be restored once they have been degraded. And so these are questions that a lot more research needs to be focused on, and something that is really missing in the literature at the moment. And so I'll leave it there. I'm happy to come back to any of these elements of how do we respond to ocean acidification in the future. And also happy to talk about which regimes at this stage have responded to this, because ocean acidification is still one of those things that has really fallen through the cracks. And it's sort of been spoken about as sitting at a really cracked interface of these international regimes and doesn't really fit nicely in any one regime. So sort of just to leave you with a thought is that how do we bring an ocean acidification regime together with the human rights regime complex and actually really think about integrating these ideas and having a holistic response to this problem. I'll leave it there. Thank you. For the question time.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating and quite a journey into the science and the policy. And maybe just a couple of quick thoughts before we pass on the floor about, I think, the importance also of the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration and how we can make links there. And also the open call for submissions by the new UN Special Rapporteur on Climate Change and Human Rights, which is looking into areas for thinking about loss and damage. And I think what you just presented might be quite fit for important submissions to be made. I think the deadline is Wednesday this week, so tomorrow. So there's still time for yourself and others to make that contribution. All right, without further ado, we'll go on to our next speaker, Julia Nakamura. She's also one of our amazing PhD researchers at the One Ocean Hub and at the Strathclyde Center for Environmental Law and Governance. in Glasgow, UK, and she's a longtime consultant with the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, specializing in small-scale fisheries. And so she will be sharing with us a reflection on climate change and the human rights of small-scale fishers. We also have another session focused on small-scale fishers' rights later this week for the school. So hopefully this will be a good start for that reflection. So Julia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Elisa, and thank you to the organizers of the school for the opportunity to present. Thank you also to the previous panelists. I think the excellent presentations. So I will start sharing my screen now. And as Elisa mentioned, I will be focusing the presentation on small-scale fishers' human rights that are impacted by a changing ocean. And I think the previous panelists really sets out an excellent background to sort of now focus on small-scale fishers' impacts by the changing ocean. So first of all, I'll give you an overview of small-scale fishers. Small-scale fisheries represent about 90% of people dependent on capture fisheries, and half of which are women. They use small fishing boats, and the length overall will vary by country. They have low levels of technology and capital investments. They produce a small quantity, much smaller than a large-scale fishing vessel per unit. And they're very diverse and dynamic. And there is, for this reason, there's no definition at the international level about small-scale fishers or small-scale fisheries. Every country will have its own, defined by either a law or policy, or sometimes not even defined yet. Small-scale fishers are also characterized by being governed by informal arrangements and customary practices. They include men, women, youth, and children who participate in all sorts of different activities which are carried out in land and at sea, as well as in inland waters. So these include preparatory activities such as building boats, fishing gears, and mending nets, as well as capture fishing and small-scale aquaculture and in inland waters and marine coastal waters, and post-harvest activities of processing the fish, trade, and marketing. Small-scale fishers are also associated with other vulnerable groups such as migrants, fish workers, indigenous peoples, and peasants. It's important to also know about their contributions, and these are just some of them. They represent the largest fisheries workforce. They contribute to about half of the global fisheries production, sustain livelihoods of local communities through providing nutritious foods, jobs, and occupations. Their culture, values, and traditional knowledge is firmly rooted in communities. There's a strong sense of community solidarity in small-scale fishing communities, and this builds their strong resilience vis-a-vis the challenges that they face. And because many of them are highly dependent on the fishery resources, they care for the fisheries, the conservation of the fishery resources, and contribute to this conservation. But the challenges are numerous, and they are vulnerable and marginalized by governments lacking financial support for sustainably developing their activities, and also for essential basic needs of education and public health, access to health and public health systems. And they also lack recognition from the legal standpoint, so lack of recognition of their customary rights, and this hinders their ability to fully enjoy their human rights. They struggle also with unequal power relations and competitions with other sectors, and they face also the challenges of overfishing, marine pollution, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, and environmental impacts such as climate change. So putting small-scale fisheries in the context of climate change, there is a growing number of literature and reports that are being issued, and which I will point out to some of them in the next slides, but this gives you an overview of the real the context of the challenges that they face in the context of climate change, which I believe have been very well already explained by Alicia, and also Mitchell gave some hints on what are the linkages. But essentially, with the impacts of climate change in the ocean, there is changes in the distribution of patterns of fish stocks, and the likelihood of having less fish stocks availability, and this decreases the capture fishing, then and this leads to greater negative impacts on both the physical and mental health and well-being of the most vulnerable and marginalized groups, such as small-scale fishers, and that will enhance the food insecurity. There will be less ecosystem services available, and this also leads to greater competition with other sectors for both space and the fishery resources, as well as leading to greater conflicts. Additionally, the sea level rise impacts extreme weather events and climate-related disasters can also lead to impacts on the coast, such as beach erosion and inundation, and communities having to be forced to relocate to other places. They lose their properties and fishing tools and facilities. But in this context, there are also opportunities for including more the small-scale fishing communities and local communities in the climate change context, in the climate change discussion. So ensuring that they participate in the development of climate change policies, strategies, and laws. And this depends also on building and strengthening their capacity to also be able to understand better how they can contribute, and using their local ecological knowledge to identify mechanisms for adapting to climate change and coming up with solutions, identifying who is responsible and able to operationalize the mechanisms in place to adapt to climate change. Now, in this slide, I highlight some of the reports that have been issued and which are particularly relevant and specifically address issues concerning small-scale fishing, small-scale fishers and small-scale fishing communities, and how they are impacted by climate change, and the importance of having this human-centered and human rights-based approach to address small-scale fishing issues, so that we ensure that in the development of climate change policies and strategies, they are fully integrated, their concerns are fully integrated. And there is this case studies that we're also already highlighting what are the changes in the fishing activities that were observed by local communities and local stakeholders. So the fact that small-scale fishers, the fish stocks are moving, the fishing vessels also have to move, and they have to fish in a longer distance from the shore, and this has greater impacts for small-scale fishers because of their lack of capacity, lack of the ability to adapt and rapidly respond to these changes. And also the need to mainstream climate risk management into development and planning of fisheries management, linkages between climate change, disaster risk, and human rights. And the table on your right also show what are the direct climate change impacts on captured fisheries, which, as emphasized, have a more impact on vulnerable communities. So also I'd like to highlight in the recent report produced by the working group to focus on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability that contributed to the 6th assessment report of the IPCC. There were some important aspects that are particularly relevant to small-scale fishers, and that speaks to the knowledge of indigenous peoples and local communities, the importance that it was given to incorporating these knowledges and ensuring that their perceptions are taken into account when shaping what is climate risk, what are the responses, and how it's important to also address historical injustices committed against these marginalized groups, and ensuring their participation in climate change decisions and the IPCC process. The principles also of distributive justice procedural justice, transparency, inclusive participation in decision-making, as well as the impacts of on the availability of food, as mentioned, biological resources for medicinal purposes, recreational opportunities, cultural heritage, and this is particularly important for fishing-dependent local communities. So there is a need to ensure this social institutional adaptation to ensure knowledge diversity, inclusive policies. And again, lots of emphasis on this, the need to ensure participation of local communities in the development of these adaptation and mitigation strategies. And there are several recommendations taken from these reports that shed light to these integrated approaches, ecosystem-based approaches to fisheries management through participatory process, such as co-management, and also ensuring that they have alternative ways to be responding to the fact that there are less availability of fish, to have also more awareness of how climate change impacts fisheries and how can they respond to that. So protecting small-scale fishers' human rights in a changing ocean, I wanted to highlight two main important instruments which are specifically relevant for small-scale fisheries. Obviously, the voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries in the context of food security and poverty eradication, which were adopted in 2014 by the FAO Committee on Fisheries, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and other people working in rural areas, which explicitly applies to any person engaged in artisanal or small-scale fishing. These are the two main instruments at the international level, which are particularly addressing small-scale fishers and their human rights, and also with reference to climate change. So if you're interested in knowing more about the comparison between these two instruments, differences and complementarities, there is a book chapter that I recently participated with Elisa, and here's the reference on the bottom if you want to know more. And I think most importantly, in terms of the recommendations, I think in the comparison between the SF guidelines and the UNDROP, it's taking, so the SF guidelines take the duty bearers perspectives and provides for these recommendations on states and non-state actors to address climate change and ensure full effective consultation with fishing communities, integrated and holistic approaches, and so to also reduce vulnerabilities, not only to the current moment, but also to potential future threats after a disaster occurs. And the UNDROP takes more of the right holders' perspectives, ensuring and reaffirming the rights of peasants and other people working in rural areas, including small-scale fishers, to contribute to, again, implementation of national and local climate change adaptation and mitigation policies, and also adequate training. So just wanted to highlight some of the findings of other papers that I participated, and that we found that in analyzing several countries' laws and policies and how they address small-scale fisheries legal issues with respect to climate change, in climate change specific laws, usually they will not have a specific reference to small-scale fishers or related terms, but they will be relevant when they talk about vulnerable and local communities, traditional communities, and related to adaptation measures. And there is very few fisheries policies addressing climate change. So there needs to be more of an integration and cross-reference between the relevant laws and policies so that the linkages are clearer. And there's also the importance of what happened after the SF guidelines were adopted. So what initiatives from the regional and national level which adopted the STEP guidelines and which contains this chapter on climate change, and how can that be further developed at other governance levels in more detail. So finally, just wanted to sort of finish my presentation with this note on the importance of advancing the human rights-based approach in the small-scale fisheries sector, so that by effectively addressing climate change, this will enforce and strengthen the protection of small-scale fishers' right to life, to property, tenure culture, adequate food, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, all of which are impacted by climate change and related disasters. So with that, I finish my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Julia. And I think it was quite fascinating to contrast how much we have advanced in the understanding of the connections between small-scale fishers' rights and climate change at the ocean nexus, and yet how much work still remains to be done in terms of operationalizing that and bringing it forward in different levels of regulation and management of the resources. But a really interesting contrast in an area where I think our understanding of human rights has really advanced significantly. So thank you so much for that. And we're now moving on to our last but not least important speaker, Joanna Dringle from the University of Glasgow, that will speak instead, I think, about a relatively more mysterious area of the climate-ocean nexus related to the international regulation of seabed mining and the impacts they may have on human rights. So Joanna, you have the floor. If we might try and keep to 15 minutes, that still leaves us more than 15 minutes for discussion at the end. Thank you.
Lisa. Good morning, everyone. Thank you also to the other panelists for their excellent presentations. It's a pleasure to be joining you all virtually today and contributing to this week's fascinating programme on water issues. I am a lawyer to the Scottish Government, where I advise on law of the sea issues, including in relation to offshore renewable energy and marine environmental protection. I'm also a visiting lecturer in international law at the University of Glasgow. Everything that I say this morning reflects my own personal opinion and does not represent the views of the Scottish Government. In my presentation this morning, I will explore some of the challenges posed by deep seabed mining in terms of climate change and human rights issues. The focus of my talk is on the deep seabed beyond national jurisdiction. This is regulated under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, and I will also refer to the work of the International Seabed Authority, the ISA, which is the intergovernmental body established under UNCLOS to govern deep seabed mining. In recent years, the industry experts have increasingly hailed the deep seabed as the next frontier in mining. It's home to a wide array of mineral resources, typically at depths of up to around 5 kilometres. Presently, deep seabed mining activities are at the exploration stage, but it is anticipated that exploitation will begin soon, and that's the actual extraction of minerals from the seafloor. In the time available today, I'm going to focus on 3 main points. So first of all, I will briefly explain the environmental context at stake here by setting out the sheer scale of the area, the deep seabed area, and its mineral resources. Second, I'm going to give a very quick snapshot of the current status of the deep seabed mining regime as regulated under UNCLOS and some of the particular challenges and tensions that we can already see arising. And then finally, following on from this, I'm going to focus specifically on the role of climate issues and human rights issues within the deep seabed mining regime. Okay, turning to my first brief point. What is the extent of the deep seabed? The deep seabed beyond national jurisdiction is known as the area. And in this image here, it's shown in white. Round about half of the Earth's surface falls within the legal definition of the area. So by any measure, the ISA's jurisdiction extends across a vast expanse. And as illustrated in this next image here, the area is home to a wealth of mineral resources, and these are located right across the oceans. At the moment, deep seabed mining is attracting increasing commercial interest because of the significant scale of these mineral resources. And Michael Lodge, who is Secretary General of the ISA, he has described the scale of these mineral deposits as staggering. Deep seabed resources are dominated by metallic minerals. And in this image here, we see the three main resource types. So polymetallic nodules, these are potato-sized rock deposits found on the ocean floor containing manganese, iron, and other metals such as copper and nickel. The cobalt-rich ferromanganese crusts, you can see them in the top image on the screen. They form commonly on seafloor ridges and rocky outcrops. Both nodules and cobalt crusts are amongst the slowest forming substances on Earth. So for example, nodules can take millions of years to form by the gradual precipitation of dissolved metals around a hard core, such as the tooth of a prehistoric shark. In contrast, polymetallic sulfides, which you can see in the glass case on the screen, they have a much more volatile origin. So they typically emanate from hydrothermal vents on the mid-ocean ridge where tectonic plates meet, causing volcanic activity. So for example, along the mid-Atlantic ridge. Okay, now that we're clear on the size of the area and the main mineral resource types present, that leads me to my second point. What is the current status of the deep seabed mining regime? Well, one significant point to note at the outset is that the regime does not specifically address either climate change or human rights issues. The main framework for deep seabed mining is contained within UNCLOS and associated instruments. And as we know, and as Mitchell touched upon, UNCLOS is very much a product of its time. It was negotiated primarily throughout the 1970s and the very early 80s. And the deep seabed mining regime in particular had a strained and heavily contested gestation period, struggling to reconcile opposing political approaches in the international community to the deep seabed in the wake of the decolonization period. But as I will be examining, just because the regime does not specifically include climate change and human rights, that does not mean that these issues will not have a bearing on the operation of the deep seabed mining regime in practice. And to give some brief context on the key legal parameters here, I know that some of you will already be familiar with the regime, but to recap briefly, I've included some of the key elements on this slide. The entire regime is premised on the fundamental overriding principle that the deep seabed and its resources are the common heritage of mankind. And some commentators have argued that the common heritage principle embodies a type of human right with humankind as the class of beneficiary. Under the deep seabed mining regime, no individual state or commercial actor can go out into the high seas and unilaterally claim sovereignty over a portion of the deep seabed or over mineral resources there. Instead, we have this one central body, the ISA, which regulates deep seabed mining on behalf of humanity as a whole. To this end, the ISA operates a contract-based system for mining activities. And it's open for participation by states parties to UNCLOS and their nationals. And also it will ultimately be open to the ISA's mining arm, the enterprise, once it becomes operational. Two pivotal aspects of the regime that I'd like to note for our purposes are the marine environmental protections, which are still being developed, and the emphasis in the regime on benefit sharing, including a particular consideration for the needs and interests of developing states. And as I will come on to consider, both of these aspects have important human rights implications. One major challenge facing the regime right now is that it's incomplete. So although the core of the regime is contained within UNCLOS, particularly in Part 11 and Annex 3, in practice, much of this was changed by the 1994 Implementation Agreement. And the 1994 agreement was, of course, the compromise that allowed UNCLOS as a whole to finally come into force in 1994, 12 long years after the conclusion of UNCLOS. While UNCLOS and the 1994 agreement, they contain the key legal framework for deep seabed mining, the ISA is under a duty to gradually develop a comprehensive set of rules for deep seabed mining, known as the Mining Code. And those rules, they will govern the entire life cycle of deep seabed mining operations. And I've noted here on the slide that at the moment, we only have 3 sets of regulations. They govern the prospecting and exploration phase for the 3 types of minerals that I've mentioned, the nodules, the sulfides, and the cobalt crusts. But crucially, the ISA is still drafting the rules for exploitation activities and the accompanying standards and guidelines. Before any extraction activities begin, these rules will need to be in place. And what we're seeing right now at the moment is the clock is really ticking, because last summer, the Republic of Nauru triggered the so-called 2-year rule. And this gives the ISA a countdown of 2 years to finalise the rules on exploitation. We're 1 year into that just now. So by next summer, the ISA is due to have the final rules on exploitation, so by July 2023. Now that we've looked at the current context, that leads me to my final and key consideration. What are the implications of deep seabed mining on climate change issues and human rights issues? Well, as I've mentioned already, the impact of climate change and the protection of human rights, these matters are not explicitly addressed within the deep seabed mining regime. However, both of these aspects underscore much of the current discourse on deep seabed mining. And on this, I'm going to make 2 points. Firstly, in terms of climate change issues, right now we're seeing growing concerns from many states around the world, the scientific community, NGOs, and civil society, including various calls for a moratorium on deep seabed mining. The deep seabed is home to a vast array of species, and it also hosts a wealth of BBNJ. The oceans play a critical role in global sustainability, for example, in regulating temperature and carbon emissions. And there are serious concerns that deep seabed mining could have a potentially devastating impact on the marine environment, including through habitat destruction and marine degradation. And one key danger is due to the sheer depth at which activities would be occurring. So could be, say, 5 kilometers down, which would make it much harder to take corrective action if problems do occur. However, as a counterpoint to this, perhaps paradoxically, proponents of mining are arguing that one of their key aims is to obtain raw materials for green energy technology. And as we all know, the global push to curb carbon emissions is leading to an unprecedented demand for critical minerals. And some experts are arguing that deep seabed minerals could provide a vital source of key metals for the energy transition. For example, copper, nickel, cobalt, and rare earth elements. And certainly the ISA and some deep seabed mining contractors are positioning themselves to be part of the just energy transition. And we can see this here For example, in the words of the ISA Secretary General a couple of years ago, where he said that the world is looking to the deep ocean for renewable energy solutions to meet growing resource demands. So what we have playing out right now is this very real tension between, on the one hand, concerns for the marine environment, and on the other, the management of commercial interests in exploiting the deep seabed in a sustainable manner. Turning to my second and final point, in relation more specifically to the issue of human rights, there are various ways in which human rights considerations impact upon deep seabed mining, including in procedural terms, in ensuring sufficient transparency in decision-making and open sharing of information concerning this crucial area, which can have a big impact on humanity. And that is a matter in relation to which the ISA has been subject to criticism. Moreover, arguably the two biggest challenges facing the deep seabed mining regime just now both have important human rights implications. And these challenges are the need to deliver robust protection for the marine environment, while also developing an appropriate benefit sharing mechanism, particularly in financial terms. The need for robust environmental protection, that of course shares common ground with the human right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. And in this respect, part of the challenge for the ISA will be to ensure that in delivering its environmental mandate, it does so in a holistic manner that reflects the broader system of international environmental law, while ensuring consistency with related and overlapping regimes, such as the emerging BBNJ regime. And as regards benefit sharing, this has similar underpinnings to human rights in terms of fairness, equity, and particularly the importance of intergenerational equity. Once commercial production begins on the deep seabed, miners will be obliged to make direct payments to the authority, and these payments are to be shared equitably on a non-discriminatory basis through a mechanism which the ISA has still to devise, but it must take the needs and interests of developing states into particular account. What is going to be really interesting to observe is how this will play out in practice if and when profits from mining begin to come in. And we are seeing significant tensions just now in the negotiation of appropriate rules for benefit sharing and the payment mechanism more broadly. This includes environmental elements in the argument that no amount of profits could make up for the damage that deep seabed mining may cause to the ecosystem services provided by the oceans and to the natural capital of the oceans. Just to finish up on a final thought, at the present moment in practical terms, this is very much a live issue as commercial activities in the deep seabed area are pushing ahead. And as this image shows, at the moment, the ISA has granted 31 contracts for exploration activities right across the oceans. These are to a mix of states, state-controlled actors, and private commercial actors. So to conclude, the next year is likely to be crucial in determining the future of the deep seabed mining regime and striving to deliver workable rules for exploitation that safeguard the marine environment while delivering sufficient benefit sharing aspects. And the adaptability of the deep seabed mining regime with the gradual evolution of the mining code, that offers some hope that climate issues and human rights concerns can be addressed. However, there are no easy answers to these challenges and a significant amount of work remains to be done. So with these final thoughts, that concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to discuss any of this during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanna. That was really incredible. You managed to cover a lot of ground, which I think is quite mysterious for most, and really bringing very much to the center those very intricate and novel human rights questions. I think one of the things that has been on my mind for a while, thinking about the negotiations of the International Seabed Authority, both in terms of protection of the marine environment and benefit sharing, is the little inputs and attention on deep sea ecosystem services and what they mean for humans on land. So thank you so much for that. We still have a quarter of an hour for questions and discussion. We have quite a good turnout today, and I can recognize a few people among the audience. So please don't be shy and ask questions and allow us to expand on some of the points we raised. Dina, maybe you'd like to break the ice?
Thank you, Elisa, and thank you to all the panelists. That was a really fascinating panel. My hand is sort of from note-taking. I learned a huge amount. I have a question that was kind of triggered for me by Alicia's presentation, but it might not only be one that Alicia can respond to, which was about the issue of redress, which I thought was kind of really interesting, and thinking about mechanisms for demanding redress and accountability. And I was thinking about climate litigation and sort of actions instituted by affected communities to demand redress and accountability. And I was wondering whether there was space for that in the sort of climate ocean context, especially in sort of difficult extra territorial environments like the deep sea. Is there any litigation happening, or if not litigation, some other kind of community-led action for redress? Could something like that exist? Is this an avenue of sort of resistance or pressure that might be explored?
That's a great question, and unfortunately one that doesn't have much of an answer at this stage. So as I mentioned, in terms of ocean acidification, there's really very little conversation around the redress side of things. So at this stage, no real conversations around community activism in terms of compensation or anything like that. There are a few instances where insurance has been taken out on coral reefs, like in Belize, for instance, not specifically around ocean acidification, but around increasing storms due to climate change. And so that insurance is actually triggered when winds reach a certain speed, and then there's a payout in order to help restore the reefs that are likely or have been impacted by those storms. So I think that that's sort of a really interesting example when thinking about sort of insurance and redress, that there might be opportunities to explore around ocean acidification as well. But I think sort of that element of community activism around ocean acidification is still something, ocean acidification is still something that is not at the forefront of most communities' awareness. And so it's really something that is not seeing huge amounts of activism around at this stage. There are some really interesting instances in the US around community action on ocean acidification. About 10 years ago, there was a massive die-off of oyster spat along the US West Coast. And so that was attributed to increased ocean acidification because of upwelling along the coast. And So the communities, some of the most important oyster hatcheries are along that coast, and the communities really banded together. And it was essentially them that got the scientists involved and were able to attribute that it was ocean acidification causing it, and they developed early warning systems to allow sort of shut-offs of any water intake from the ocean into the hatcheries and things like that. So I think that's a really interesting example of sort of adaptive responses, perhaps, maybe not redress in that instance, where it was really community-led. But as I said, there are so few examples at this stage, just because it's something that we're still grappling with as to sort of the attribution element. And it just so happened that along the west coast of the US, there was a very clear linkage that could be shown to ocean acidification.
It's fascinating, actually. Great question, Dina. Thank you so much. Are there any other questions or comments from the floor? Also, I think panelists should feel free to ask questions to each other or draw links between your respective areas that were.
There's a comment in the chat. Maybe you want to read it out, Lisa, if you can see it.
Yeah, let's see. Oh, so from Holly Niner, who's also one of our outstanding early career researchers at the One Ocean Hub. So yeah, she's speaking about loss and damage and how that can respond to demands of human rights, particularly when considering some of the diffuse broad-scale impacts. Any thoughts on this challenge or examples where discussions or negotiations have considered specific examples and contexts? Great question, Holly, particularly for the open call for inputs from the new UN Special Rapporteur on Climate Change. I don't know if any of the colleagues on the panel have suggestions. Quite a bit of work has been done by the High Commissioner for Human Rights on what loss and damage means from a human rights perspective, but not yet looking at the ocean climate nexus. So it'll be interesting to hear if any of us has any insights to share at this stage. Mitchell?
Yeah, sure. So I guess it's just to say, in terms of kind of loss and damage under the UN climate regime, I mean, ocean acidification is explicitly included there as a sort of a slow onset event, but it doesn't really seem to have been anything kind of done by either the kind of Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage or anywhere else in the kind of UNFCCC bodies that are responsible for that. So I think that's interesting, and whether or not that will then come out at future kind of ocean climate dialogues or in future COPs on how to kind of address loss and damage issues through ocean acidification, I think will be really interesting. And I guess then the other point about, I guess, kind of reflecting on loss and damage that was discussed during the ocean climate dialogue at the Substa last week. I mean, very little, if any, kind of human rights language was kind of used in that 4-hour meeting, and I thought that was quite concerning in many respects. So the fact that, you know, the damage and redress from impacts of ocean acidification was brought up by a number of states and NGOs, the human rights implications therein weren't mentioned, which I just thought was rather odd. However, I remember watching a meeting earlier on in the day about kind of climate finance and human rights, and of course that was great, but then no mention of the ocean in that discussion. And so despite the fact that everybody's in the same place, sometimes people seem to be kind of talking cross purposes. So yeah, I guess that was just my kind of input on ocean acidification and as an example of loss and damage and how that could be operationalized. Yeah.
Thank you. Any more comments from our panelists? I think there's still time for one more question or maybe two.
Can I maybe just add to what Mitchell was saying, that ocean acidification was listed as one of the slow onset events, as was sea level rise, so 2 ocean impacts. Ocean acidification in subsequent reports was also noted as one of the most difficult slow onset events to address. So in some ways, I feel like because of that recognition of how difficult it is to address, that most efforts have, at this stage, perhaps been targeted at the easier slow onset events to address, which are still very difficult. Slow onset events in general are very difficult to address by their nature. How do you establish activities and efforts now to address something which is only going to happen in the future, and we're not quite sure how it's going to play out? So by the very nature of what a slow onset event is, it's very challenging to address. So I think in that sense, ocean acidification perhaps has been left to see how the other slow onset events can be addressed, and perhaps ocean acidification will be picked up once we've got a better idea of how perhaps some of those other issues can be addressed. But I think also sea level rise is something we as the panel should also be thinking about here as well. Sea level rise has substantial impacts to coastal communities, to marine ecosystems, and also something that really needs to be thought of in terms of loss and damage as well.
Thank you. And I see there's a question for Joanna in the chat about, I think, the scale of the monetary benefits that could be shared by the ISA, and the interests of previously resource disadvantaged nation states, and I guess expectations around that, and also the question of the moratorium and the legal grounds for it. So I wonder if Joanna, you'd like to pick up on these points.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the very interesting questions. Yeah, I mean, these are some of the challenges that the ISA and everyone with an interest in deep seabed mining is grappling with at the moment. I think particularly on the financial side, there is a lot of concern about how much will really be coming in as profits, particularly given that any initial money the ISA receives has to cover its operating costs. So there's an increasing realization that, well, there's a lot of concern that any economic benefits from this will they ultimately go to the contractors rather than there being a sufficient pot to redistribute in an equitable manner, taking the interests and needs of developing states into particular account. And I think the work of the ISA Council's African group has been really interesting on this. So the African group have made a lot of comments, and they have been saying that really the potential economic models under consideration may not be sufficient to deliver tangible benefits to humanity. And they're also, the African group and also other interested parties are saying we need to think about the global net benefit in terms of will it be sufficient to justify potentially having an impact on the marine environment. So I think that's one of the particular aspects that the ISA is looking at just now, and there's a lot of work being done. And I think that it is challenging to try and think of a way through this and to find an economic model that would work. And on the moratorium point, I mean, yes, that's also a really good point, because obviously we do have this global system for deep seabed mining. And really, I would say one of the triumphs of the regime is it's the first time in history where the world has come together before an activity starts and has decided on a set of rules for it. So to that extent, it's, really is something to behold. And in particular, something that interests me about it and many others is that there are binding obligations on corporate actors within the deep seabed mining regime, which you do not often see in international law. So I don't have a final answer on those points other than to agree that there are some real challenges there.
Thank you so much, John. I see that there's more and more interest in the chat about the ISA, but we probably don't have time to answer that live, although you may try in the chat, or maybe Dina, if we save the chat, we could send an email to participants with further responses. Just on my side to mention, there's another really interesting comment around global north and global south justice issues. And I think these are really important elements that actually human rights helps us to address. And so just to mention, towards the end of this week, there'll be another session on ocean plastics, where we really look at, that particular example of how we can shed light on those global north, global south inequity issues and use human rights to address them or try and bring them to the fore. So thank you also for the documents that were shared in the chat. As I'm also running in the next session, I think I'll have to bring this one to a close on a timely basis, but I just would like to thank all the panelists. This was incredible, and we could go on and on. So maybe we'll have to think about how to go forward with these conversations, and hopefully the Global Network and UNEP will support us in that. Dina, you'd like to close more formally?
Just to say a huge thanks to all of our panelists. That was extraordinary.
Ja, men vad häftigt.
An extraordinary range of that was an extraordinary overview of the topic of the ocean and climate nexus, such a complicated topic, and I think you gave us just a remarkable insight into a very complex issue from a few different angles. Many thanks to Elisa for being our extraordinary moderator today. As Lisa said, we have a number of sessions coming up that explore different aspects of the ocean, including the next one, which I strongly recommend you all sign up for. Have a look at our program to see what else is happening this week. And I hope we all see you in half an hour, in short time. Our recording is going to be up on our website and on YouTube, so please come back and listen again if there's anything you wanted to hear more about. And just a last thanks to the One Ocean Hub and to our extraordinary panelists today. See you all shortly.